And next up today, we have Sustainable Open Source Contribution in Your Business by your friend and mine, Stefan Koopmanschap. Scoop is an old friend of mine as well. We haven't met up for a while, but a family man, does a weekly radio show and attends conferences and user group meetings, of course. Stefan runs a company called, well, now I'm going to try and say this, Ingewikkeld, and organizes the WeCamp and another conference, which I'm sure we can talk about it. So yeah, let's introduce Scoop into the stage. Stefan, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, especially now that I've heard you butcher both my name and my company name.
What can I say? You're the only person where there wasn't a break beforehand, so I could prime my pronunciation skills. So yeah, nice to see you. How's everything going with you?
Hi, it's good. Things are looking up with more people getting vaccinated and stuff like that, and business is going well. So I'm fine.
That is good news. And today you're going to talk to us about sustainable open source contributions, and you have a pre-recorded video. So I'm looking forward to that. So how do I pronounce your company name and your actual name correctly?
So my name is Stefan Koopmanschap.
Yeah, okay.
And the company name is Ingewikkeld.
Yeah, that's just noise to me. Let's see you talk, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards.
Yes.
So let's see the video. Thanks.
Hi, and welcome to my talk. It's good to have you here for my talk about combining two things that many people don't think go together well: open source and business. I realize I'm standing between you and your lunch, but I think I have an important thing to say, so let's keep some focus for a little while longer. Let's first introduce myself a bit. My name is Stefan Koopmanschap. I run a company called Ingewikkeld. I don't do that by myself. I do that together with my wife and our business partner Mike. And before I started this company, I worked for a lot of different companies, for instance, TomTom or iBuildings. And I also had several different positions. I worked as a developer, I worked as a team lead, I worked as a tech lead. So I've seen the programming world from a lot of different viewpoints. And before I even started working for all those companies, I learned PHP. I did that somewhere at the end of 97, early 98. I started learning PHP. And one of the ways that I learned about PHP was by downloading scripts from the internet and looking at them, seeing what they did, and trying to apply the solutions that I found in those scripts in my own work. This was the day that a lot of the programming was still mixed up. So there was HTML, there was PHP, there was SQL, all in the same file. It's something that we don't realize anymore these days, because now we have a lot of frameworks and things like that. But back in those days, this was the normal way of doing things. There was a lot of include statements at the top of the files because there was no way of automatically requiring stuff. There was not even really, an object model in PHP back then. So not long after I started to learn PHP and using the open source scripts as a consumer by downloading it and learning from it, I actually thought maybe I should give back to the open source world, because I felt that I owed a lot of gratitude to the people that built all those scripts and applications that I could benefit from, and I wanted to give something back. And I think a lot of other people will owe a similar gratitude to all of those people that did open source back then. So soon after, learning PHP a bit more, I dove into the world of open source. Now let's start with a bit of history. One of the reasons that I'm speaking on this topic now was because I was invited to speak on this topic at the beginning of this year for another conference. And I felt, wow, this is actually something that is important, and not a lot of people actually pay attention to this subject. But perhaps more important is because I've always been trying to contribute to open source in one way or another. By myself, I spent hours and hours and hours and days and days and days on, writing documentation, writing code, and contributing to open source in that way. And with the company Ingewikkeld, we're really trying to make an effort to make regular contributions to open source as well. And I think one of the reasons that our company has been pretty successful in doing just that is because I've seen it fail so often. And failure is a good thing. I mean, we can learn a lot from making mistakes. Now, I can tell you that a lot of my failures are things that I learned from, but also I learned a lot from failures of other people. So let's focus on a couple of things that I've seen over the years, that I've seen go wrong over the years, that I think we can learn from together. So we're going to go through some stories about open source. Now, the first place where I saw a real effort to start contributing to open source was an employer that really wanted to try their best. This was a company that was focusing on delivering high quality software to their customers. They had some open source packages themselves, but that was mostly the effort of some of the early employees that had been there for years, and over the years they'd open sourced some of the work that they'd done for customers. They really wanted to, promote to all of their developers that contributing to open source was a cool thing to do, and so they were setting aside time on Fridays for contributing to open source. And this company was a really cool company. They went out of their way to make sure that the developers were comfortable. They invested a lot of their profits in having people attend conferences, getting them training, getting them the best hardware and all the software that they needed. And they had grown to be this company over the years. Originally, they weren't like that, but at some point they realized this is a good way of doing things. Now, one of the problems was that their rates were acceptable, but not realistic with what they were trying to achieve. And with every new thing that they started investing in, they didn't also raise their rates towards their customers. So a lot of their early customers were also still customers for years and years and years because they were delivering good work. However, the rates hadn't changed over all of those years. So some of their customers were even paying lower rates than the most recent customers. And the result of that was when the economy went down, there was a problem. Because their income was going down, but they were still investing a lot. So more money was going out than was coming in. And a result from that was that all of the developers, everyone had to suddenly drop all of their open source work because everyone had to make more billable hours, which, I can understand because it was necessary for the company to survive. But once the economy was going up again, the open source stuff didn't really come back, or at least a lot less than before. And even at that point, they had not really learned their lesson about their rates. They were still selling themselves for a too low rate, causing shortages in money, basically. This is preventable. And of course, it's not good for developer morale to have to stop something that you really enjoy. And once things look better, you cannot start again. So that was a bit of a problem. Now, for the second case, I will tell you about one of my own failures. Because I really learned from this. I was hired by a company to be their tech lead with the express idea that I was going to bring in some expertise about open source. Because I've been doing open source for a couple of years and they wanted to start contributing a bit more to open source. They were already using a lot of open source, but they thought this Stefan guy, he's good at tech, so he can be a good developer, but he also brings in some experience with the open source world, and maybe we can, contribute something back. So after being there for a while, I proposed the 20% rule, where people can spend 20% of their work time, which would be usually the Fridays, on writing code and doing other stuff that benefits open source. And the project manager was interested in all of this, and he really applauded that whole idea of contributing back to the software that we were using for free. And one of the owners was also very interested. He was the one that did all the finances and the business stuff. So this felt like, I had solid support from the whole organization to start off this idea. And having the support from the person that does the finances really helps in this. And indeed, the owner that was on board with this idea, he said, okay, we're going to change our rates a bit so that we make sure that we can basically finance the open source work from the money that we get from our customers. So we could do less billable hours and still make sure that enough money comes in so we can pay all of the stuff that needs to be paid. So this was great, and we were sure that we wouldn't be able to, get into the situation that I described before, where at some point we couldn't pay everything anymore. Now, this new idea, it was off to a good start, but then the trouble began, because the other owner was the person doing all the sales. And he wasn't really on board with this whole new open source thing. Open source was something that, you could use to earn money. That was basically his idea. He was like, why are we going to spend time? And with that time, we're going to spend money on something that, doesn't really benefit us. That was his idea of things. So he kept on selling projects based on our old availability of 5 days a week for all developers. So it didn't take long for projects not to hit their agreed deadlines. And this caused some really heated arguments. In the end, the first owner had to budge, the one that handles the finances. And the second owner, he wouldn't budge, so he kept on selling full capacity, which basically means we had to throw away all of our nice ideas about open source and contributing because, we had to work. It was impossible not to finish the client work. Now, getting started with open source as a business isn't easy. Based on these two cases and on my personal experience, I'd say that there are a couple of important things that you need to take care of before you even start with open source. First of all, get the full support of all stakeholders. And with stakeholders, I mean the business, the financial people, the sales people, the development managers. Everyone needs to be on board, including your full management. Because if even one of those people is not on board, they can basically cancel the whole thing because, of course, they are the boss. They are one of the bosses. So they can block the whole thing and make sure that you cannot contribute to open source. So make sure that you get the full support of everyone in your company, preferably. The second thing to make sure of is that your financial situation is good enough for you to be able to spend those hours on open source. If you decide that 1 day a week is for open source, make sure that the 4 billable days that you have where you do client work will cover the cost of that 5th day. Or if you decide, we're going to spend 1 day every 2 weeks, still the rates have to be adjusted to be able to cover for that 1 day every 2 weeks. And this is a general tip anyway. There's so many PHP developers, whether it's freelancers or agencies or you name it, that there's a lot of them that don't charge enough for their work. Their rates are unrealistically low. We are in a business of learning, and we have to invest in learning and things like that. And if you charge a rate that is way too low, then you have no time to learn or do other stuff than just work billable hours. And of course, my rates will be different from yours because my company is in a different place than yours, and your rates may be higher or lower. That doesn't really matter. As long as we're in sort of the same range, it's going to be fine. The most important thing is if you have a rate, if you determine on what your rate will be, make sure to calculate in some time for the stuff that's not billable, such as your company administration, learning, open source, things like that. And I think that if you look at, for instance, the past year, the year of Corona, there's a lot of companies that had lower rates, that had a really, really hard time surviving. And it hasn't been easy for our company, but one of the reasons why we've been able to survive is because we had some reserves. We had some extra money to spare, and we could, survive having a bit less work. And the last thing that I want to tell you as well is, which makes it a lot easier to contribute to open sources, if you do it right from the start. Because then you're always used to this situation where your billable hours have to pay for the non-billable hours. And it's a lot harder to implement something like this if you're already used to a certain way of working. So if you start a new company, if you start freelancing, make sure that you keep some time reserved that is not billable for stuff that you want to do outside of the billable hours. If that is not your situation, you're already in a company, and then you'll have to, dig through this whole thing of making that switch. Now, how we started with my company. Basically, I started like this. When I started the company, I decided, okay, from day one, I'm going to only be billable for 32 hours a week. And the Friday would be the day that I could spend on other stuff. And other stuff in my case, and it was also, the business administration, but also open source or research and development, making sure that I had some time to spare on other stuff. And as the business progressed from just me to a business with several employees, one thing stayed constant. The Friday was the open source day, the learning day, the administration day, the day that we spent on stuff that wasn't billable. So when calculating our rates, we also always made sure that we had 32 billable hours and the rates were high enough to cover the other 8 hours a week that we could, spend on other stuff. Plus, of course, a healthy margin for building up a bit of reserve. Usually that meant we would work for customers on Monday to Thursday, and then on Friday, we would work on other stuff, open source, internal projects, things like that. And I'm saying open source, but it wasn't just, contributing code to open source projects. We didn't only work on creating pull requests. We do a lot of other stuff as well. Basically, if you have a bigger organization than just you, everyone could work on something that they wanted to work on. So let me mention some of the most important projects that we work on. One of the people that works for Ingewikkeld is a contributor to PHP Unit. And as such, he has been spending some of his time working on PHP Unit. He recently focused on the whole dependency injection part of PHP Unit. And another project that has gotten quite some attention during the open source hours at Ingewikkeld is PHP Documenter. And this is surely the result of two of the core developers of PHP Documenter being employed by Ingewikkeld. So it's pretty clear in this case why these people have chosen to work on those projects, because they're involved with those projects. We facilitate from our company, we facilitate that they can spend some time on open source, and they spend their time on these projects. That makes sense. And just to be clear, the hours that these people spend on those projects, it's not just during company time. They spend quite some time in their own time as well on this, but we've been facilitating this, and the feedback that I've gotten from them is that they really appreciate the company facilitating this work. But again, contributing to open source is so much more than just code. For this talk, I asked my developers to list some of the things that they've recently done for open source projects. And that includes things like creating rector rules to migrate a project from Mockery to Prophecy, or creating a bug report to the Psalm project, or add PHP8 support to some of the PHP Documenter components, reporting bugs to Symfony, contributing to a PSR, or helping users of an open source project on Twitter. And another way of contributing to the open source community is by organizing events. And two main events that we organize from Ingewikkeld are Weekend, which is a 5-day coding retreat on a private island in the Netherlands. And of course, since COVID, blocked us from organizing a physical event, we decided, we're going to have a bit more fun with events. And we started Conference, which is an online conference, a free online conference, focusing not just on the technology, but also on the subjects around that, such as, people or processes or things like that. We did that last year because we couldn't organize Weekend, and we decided to do it again this year. So it's going to be happening in October. It's going to be free, and the website is conference.online. Now, one of the best ways to start contributing to open source is to start small. Even if you don't have dedicated time for open source, small bug fixes can be a tremendous help to an open source project. So while you're still working on a normal customer project and you're using open source, if you find a bug and you have an easy way of fixing it, then you could spend a little bit of your working time or even your free time on fixing that bug and sending in a pull request to the open source project. Stuff like that really, really helps open source developers because they have to do everything. They have to do the maintenance on their project, but also they have to, implement big new features and things like that. So if they don't have to spend their time on the small bugs, they can focus on the big improvements, on looking at the future of their project. Things like that, also contributing documentation, makes them focus on the bigger picture, which is important because that's their job. They maintain the project. And I'm not saying that every single job will be willing to accommodate you doing stuff like this during work time. But in most cases, I've found that because you're fixing a bug that you're encountering in your work, which might be blocking for your work, most bosses, managers are willing to say, okay, spend some time on that, fixing that, so that we can move on with our project because it's blocking our project. Another thing that you can do is be active in the community. And the community is not one specific thing. The community is there on Twitter, is there on Slack, is there on IRC, is there on any other chat system or forum. So if you see a question that you know the answer to, you contribute to that open source project if you answer to that question and help someone who is stuck with something. So it doesn't have to be code that you contribute. It can be as simple as answering a question that makes sure that you contribute something and that the developer of that open source project doesn't have to answer that question and can focus on other stuff. A similar thing goes for Reddit or Stack Overflow. If you're there and people have a question, just answer it. That goes a really long way for the person asking the question and also for the people that run the open source project. Now, over the years, I've gotten one question several times, and that's, how do you pick a project to work on? And these were mostly aimed at, larger contributions to open source. How do I pick a project that I can spend a lot of time on? But there's a lot of ways of contributing, as I mentioned before, and the best way to determine, what project should we focus on is, okay, let's have a look at our organization. Let's have a look at our company. Who is working for us? And what are the projects that these people use on a regular basis? These are great candidate projects, because if you contribute to those projects, you benefit yourself as well from the improvements to that project. So that's a great way to figure out, where can we start contributing, especially when you have people on board that already have a lot of experience with certain projects. It may make that easier for them to contribute to that project than when you just randomly pick an open source project and say, let's contribute to that. And the same goes for the projects that we use in our own projects. So, we are familiar with using, I don't know, if you work on Symfony, with Symfony a lot, then contributing to Symfony will make sense. If you work with Laravel a lot, contributing to Laravel makes sense. If you work with Drupal a lot, same thing. Contributing to Drupal makes sense. But if you use Drupal uses Symfony under the hood. So contributing to Symfony will also benefit Drupal. So you can look at projects that you use on a day-to-day basis, see also what their dependencies are, and in that way help improve not just the project that you're working with, but also the other projects that use this specific dependency. And as such, there's a lot of projects like Symfony, but also PHP Unit and also PHP Documenter. And there's a lot of projects that have components that are used by tens or maybe even hundreds of other projects. And that's all nice, but there's another question that I get every once in a while. Why? Why would you contribute to open source? Well, first of all, because it is good open source citizenship. Open source is not just there to take from. It's not just a free source of code that you can use in your next project. The only way open source succeeds is by the contributions of many other people. And if I see that some of the very popular projects in the PHP ecosystem are still maintained mostly by one or two people, that is very sad, because these people have jobs as well, because they have to earn their money, and they don't earn it usually from open source. And they put in a lot of time, and aside from some random contributions, most of the work is still done by one or two people. So if you are a happy user of open source code, then if you can, you should contribute something. Code, design, documentation, anything that can help a project. And then there is the thing that I mentioned before, the benefit to yourself as a developer or to your company. Remember that if you invest 8 hours a week from a single developer, that you get hundreds and hundreds of hours of work from other contributors for free. And I don't think any stock investments, cryptocurrency investments, startup investments have such a high return on investment in such a short time frame. Even that cryptocurrencies, the Bitcoin and stuff like that, you get some return on investment there, but usually that's in the long run, not in the short run. And then there's another benefit, and that is that if your developer contributes to open source, they learn something, because contributing to open source is a learning experience. And the learning experience will vary from, working in different contexts and working with different people, but also, just seeing other people's code and contributing to that, it helps a lot. It learns people how to communicate with other people. It learns, from getting code reviewed writing tests, writing documentation that is very often required in the open source space. And they also benefit from a morale boost of an accepted pull request. If you send a pull request to an open source project and that pull request gets accepted, that is a really nice feeling. And they will also learn from the disappointment when a pull request is rejected. And they learn from the feedback that they get when a pull request is rejected. You know, how could I have looked at this differently? So it is, you know, good open source citizenship. There is a benefit to you, to your developer as well. And there is one more thing, and that's marketing. Because contributing to open source can give your company a good name, you know, in the open source world. Potential customers may find your contributions when they're searching for information on either your company or your product or on that open source product, and they may see your name come by. Plus, if you start offering your own open source stuff, for instance, if you offer an API and you have your own API client, it will help because people will see that come by and then they discover maybe that your API does that one thing that they need. They may become your customer. So there is a lot of different things that will help. And I've not mentioned one more thing. There's so many benefits, and that is recruitment. Because contributing to open source can give your company an advantage over other companies. Because if people have seen your name, if developers have seen your name come by in the open source space and they are looking for a new job and they see that you have a job opening, then they may remember, oh, wait a minute, this is the company that had that open source package. This is interesting to work for that company. I would like to work for them because they spend some time on open source. Several of the people working for Ingewikkeld have mentioned expressly to me that part of their choice for Ingewikkeld was because they're allowed to contribute to open source on company time. Better yet, one of the people that now works for Ingewikkeld was introduced to me by Sebastian Bergman of PHP Unit. It's connections like that where the company can benefit a lot. Because if I would have to pay for a recruiter to find me a developer, it would have, cost me a lot more money than contributing to open source. And since recruitment is not the only thing that I spend this money on, but also all of the other benefits, I get a lot more bang for my buck. So if you're interested in open source, well, maybe this is a whole set of good reasons for starting to contribute. And actually, there's one more reason. Because doing open source work can actually earn you money. Because open source is great, but not everyone understands software. And they may know of open source and they may have heard of WordPress or Magento or Symfony or Drupal. But that doesn't mean that they can actually set it up correctly or brand it correctly or install the right extensions or write custom modules. And if you contribute to an open source project, that often raises your profile as an expert on that specific project. And that may attract customers because if there is a customer that says, I want a web shop and I've heard about Magento, but I have no idea how to install Magento and how to get these extensions up and running and make sure that I have my own design on that. And you've contributed to Magento, then your company is sort of linked with Magento. And if they start looking around for people that know a bit about Magento, they may just come to you and say, I saw that you've contributed to this project. And I'm starting to, I want to start a new project, a new web shop, but I have no idea how to do that. Can you help me? So this may actually attract customers for you. And, even if you offer some of your time for free to the open source project, you could always get new projects, new implementations or training or consultancy, stuff like that, and actually earn money indirectly from contributing to open source. And, unfortunately, in the capitalist world that we live in, money makes the world go round. And there's enough in the open source world. So if you look at, Symfony, for instance, the company behind that, Sensio, is a very successful company. In the case of Magento and also Typo3 and Cilius, there are companies behind those projects these days that make a lot of money off of the open source projects that they've created. And more companies are offering services to support open source. And you could be one of them. I mean, you don't have to be the company behind a project, but if you can tell your customers, this is what we do, this is our expertise, and we could help you, then they may just think, this is interesting. We could hire them to get this next project up and running. So open source is great, but it can be a lot greater if more companies would start to contribute to open source. Now, if there are any questions, let me know. Just before answering the questions, I would like to ask you a question. Please let me know if you have any feedback on this talk. You can let me know and join in the link on the slide. If you go there, let me know what I did well or what I could improve on. And just for clarity, this is where you can get in touch with me or get more information about me or my company and the events that we organize. Thank you very much.
Hey, Stefan, how you doing? Thank you very much for that. I really enjoyed.
You're welcome.
I really
Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. It seems like half of the internet is down at the moment, so there's a lot of kerfuffle going on, but we're okay. We're sat here in Hopin. You can still see and hear all of our speakers, which is awesome. So yeah, hopefully we don't get affected by that. But yeah, I don't see any questions in chat, but I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask if you're okay with that. So
sure.
I mean, I guess I've spoken about this myself at events about that first step into open source into contributing back into open source can be quite intimidating. And do you have any kind of recommendations about what could be a first step for someone to get into open source?
Well, there is always the misconception that contributing to open source also always has to be pull requests, send in code, and I can understand that it is quite intimidating to, if you're a user of Symfony, that you have to send in a pull request to this major project. But there's a lot of other things that I also mentioned in the talk that you can do, like writing documentation or offering support. If you've been working with a certain open source project for a while, you can probably answer questions on Stack Overflow or on Twitter, or these days, most of the projects have their own Slack channels as well, things like that. So that's a very easy first step that you can do. And once you feel a bit more confident, or you find a bug or something that you can solve, then you can make that next step.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think the other thing for me is if you are going to make a code contribution, it doesn't have to be this huge new feature. It can be like a tiny tweak to existing code. And for me, like what I found was if you're not particularly comfortable in just making that pull request and getting the feedback, then a lot of people who are contributors would quite happily give you feedback like out of the sight of GitHub initially, without you needing to kind of put yourself right out there, because I think that's what's quite scary for some people, is getting that feedback out in the open. I was lucky enough to have people when I started contributing who would look at my PRs and give me a little bit of feedback before I made it a public PR. So you'd be very surprised. Hit me up on Twitter, and I'm sure there's other people in the chat who would say the same thing if you do need some help getting into open source.
Yeah.
We do have some questions now. So do you have any material, Stefan, for the devs that want to pitch open source contributions to their higher ups? And if you do, where do they find it? And if they don't, I guess we should start that.
Yeah, this is actually a great idea. Maybe I'll have to turn this a bit more into like a blog post, because you could probably show this video or make a summary of this video and use some of the stuff that I talked about to talk to our higher ups. But most of the management layers, myself being one of them these days, they are triggered more by numbers than stories. So maybe look at the last time that you spent time on a bug which turned out to be in whatever open source project you were using, how much time you spent on that, and how much time you save by you or other people fixing those bugs. Because if you had to write all of that yourself without the use of open source code, you would have spent way more time having to fix that bug or develop whatever you're developing. But just to answer the question quickly, I do not have any specific material at this point, but it's a good idea. I'll have to maybe work on that.
Awesome, thanks. And a slight change on that, but do we have any recommendations for pitching funding existing open source projects to bosses or higher ups or to company owners? I think that's potentially an easier win for me. I'd be interested to know what you would think.
Well, the funny thing is that, and I've seen this happen a couple of times, that some managers have a much easier time giving just a bag of money to whoever is developing open source than to donate their own time to that, because they need their own people for their own projects, things like that. So that might actually be easier if you look at the projects that you've been using. And these days you have Patreon, you have GitHub, and there's a couple of other ways of donating to projects, either on a one-time basis or on a regular basis. Then doing things like that might actually be easier. Another way to do that, I mentioned a couple of companies like Sensio, who are the creators of Symfony, or there's actually now a company called Symfony as well, who are doing all of the development of Symfony, and they sell some products on the side as well. So then you get something back actually for the money that you give them to work on Symfony, either by getting training from them or getting their hosted cloud software or cloud hosting thing, things like that. So that actually gives you something in return for giving them money, which may actually be interesting to your manager.
Yeah, I see more and more people as well. For example, there's a ticket open and they need that bug fixed, and they don't have time to fix it themselves. And I've seen people recently saying, "Look, can we pay you to fix that bug quickly for us?" And that's kind of a win-win, where the person who's receiving the money, the contributors who are receiving the money are receiving some money, and the people who are waiting for the bug fix to be merged can merge it. I see a lot of discussions in the chat about the tax implications and things about that, and I understand that that's a concern for a lot of people, but for a lot of people it's not a concern. And financially funding open source contributors via GitHub sponsorships or Patreon or other ways, we should be doing that anyway if we use those projects. I don't know. Symfony and Laravel, those big projects, they seem to be doing okay, thank you, because they have a product they can sell. But under the hood, they are using things like Ramsey UUID, is used across the web everywhere. Things like I know Marco's in the chat. The proxy manager is used in across the place, and these are the places I feel like need the financial benefit.
Yeah, exactly. And these days, there's also companies that release open source products that also have their own elephants. It's simple things like that where you can give a bit of money to them to fund their work on open source.
Yeah, we're running out of time, sadly. I can see a couple of questions. So I guess we can rattle through these really quickly as it's only lunch, if you're okay with that, Scoop.
I'm fine.
So how to find co-devs to get a project going and get out of the half a dev dilemma. I think that's kind of out the scope, but maybe we can nip into if you click on the sessions tab, there's a hallway track. If you want to discuss that stuff, then the hallway track could be a really good place to do that. And most of the customers do not choose companies based on their GitHub contributions. What do you think about this? I don't really understand that. Most of the customers do not choose companies based on their...
Yeah, I understand what is meant, I guess, is that most of my clients, I'm not a good example. A lot of web agencies or freelance developers, they are not being their customers are not finding them through what they're doing on GitHub, and that is indeed correct. But that maybe also means that maybe you have to find those customers that are actually finding you through GitHub. And there's other ways. Again, GitHub is just the code. If you start blogging about something or speak at a conference about a certain topic, you will stand out as being one of the experts around that specific topic. And whether that is an open source package or a specific technology that you want to work with, it's all, aside from having fun, I mean, except that we're not actually in Verona right now, it's speaking on such topics or blogging or writing articles, things like that, making live videos on Twitch like you do, Gary. It makes you stand out, and customers may just find you through those kinds of ways.
Yeah, I agree. The personal value to being able to contribute to open source is massive, and I think that the message that companies who are using these products should be responsible for, for giving back to the projects they're making money off is an amazing message, and one we should be talking more about. So yeah, thank you so much, Scoop. Awesome discussion going on in the chat. We could totally take that to the hallway track if you wanted to, because there is a hallway track in the left-hand pane in Hopin. You can click sessions and hallway track. So we're going to go into a break now, but before I send us there, I'll just say thanks again, Scoop. Always nice to hang out with you, and we'll see you soon.
Yes, bye-bye.